Chapter 1. Learning to pay cognizance when our instinct tells us something is amiss. Rita Spiff, an event planner from downtown New York, was on vacation in the Caribbean. A male friend invited her out to dinner, to which she conceded. Spiff met this fellow not long after arriving at the popular Caribbean resort. He was American but had resided on the island for several years. Spiff and her friend strolled out on the agreed date on what turned out to be a breezy and surreal evening. Upon arrival at the venue, a strong reluctance to dine at the restaurant fell upon Spiff. It was an open-air restaurant with several other guests seated, apparently having a lovely time. That evening was not Spiff's first time at the restaurant in question, making a strange feeling almost unfounded. Spiff's friend would eventually notice her temporary withdrawal and urge her to chill out and have a good time. It is often surprising how accurate a mere hunch can be in the long run. Before long, a free-for-all broke out in the restaurant and everyone scampered for safety. The duo hurriedly left the restaurant for safer enclaves. But Spiff could not solve the puzzle of how she knew something out of the normal would happen. But her experience is not unique. Experienced connoisseurs of art pieces can determine at first glance if a work of art is genuine or fake. Psychologists and other empirical experts have conducted several relatable research and studies on how our intuition works. You don't need an academic understanding of this concept to glean its manifold benefits. To better understand and utilize your previously marginalized cognitive abilities, endeavor to stay with this summary to the end. Chapter 2. The Four Horsemen of Relationships are defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and contempt. Psychologist John Gottman, Ph.D., hooked Bill and Sue to machines to measure their heart rates and perspiration while he recorded their conversation. The discussion seemed normal and reminiscent of the type that couples have, but there was more to it than the playful banter about the dog being oily. The conversation revealed a lot about the young couple. Dr. Gottman believed that he could determine if a couple would still be together at 90% accuracy by measuring moments of conflict. So, he measured their heart rates and perspiration and studied their facial expressions when discussing the traditional beliefs of money, sex, children, jobs, and in-laws. He found that their constantly changing combinations determine the couple's compatibility. Married couples communicate in subtle ways, such as rolling of the eyes, which is indicative of contempt, the yes-but tactics, which are coded as defensive, facial expressions, and gesticulation. John Gottman. Dr. Gottman has studied more than 3,000 married couples like Bill and Sue and discovered a method of focusing on what he needed to look out for. He called it the Four Horsemen. Defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and contempt, with contempt the most important. The difference between contempt and criticism is that contempt seems to criticize for a superior plane. Using the analogy of an interview for a job, Dr. Gottman shows that quick appraisals can at times be more insightful than lengthy drilling. He proposed that some psychological research suggests one could know more about a candidate for a job in a short meeting than in a week. Samuel Gosling, a psychologist, did a psychology workup on 80 college students. Or extroversion, trusting or agreeable, organized or conscientious, worried or emotional stability, and imaginative or openness to new expressions they were. He then had their closest friends assess them, and finally strangers based on their student dorm rooms. The strangers were surprisingly more accurate than their closest friends despite the small sample of evidence. Chapter 3. People can be made to behave in certain ways without being brainwashed. Throughout Vic Brandon's career as a tennis coach, he discovered he could predict when a player would commit a double fault. Brandon's ability to predict double faults can be compared to an art historian's skill in recognizing a bogus Greek artifact. They both use their adaptive unconscious. The thing about snap judgments is that it is unexplainable, and the attempts to explain them are often unconvincing. We have, as human beings, a storytelling problem. We're a bit too quick to come up with explanations for things we don't really have an explanation for. Malcolm Gladwell. In psychology, you will often hear the term thin slicing. This means looking for and finding trends and patterns in specific things by only using very small pieces of information to do so. Basically, you're basing your judgment on less than the whole picture. In one experiment, a researcher pretended to be a professor and gave a list of 5-word sets for a scrambled sentence test. The sentences include us, bingo, sing, let, play. When the students left the professor's office, the researcher discovered that they walked out more slowly than they had walked in. The explanation was that the list contained words that made people walk more slowly. The study showed that people could be influenced to behave in certain ways without being brainwashed. Priming infringes on the notion of free will, and this can be challenging. Speed dating is a good example of snap judgment because it makes people form quick opinions about others. In speed dating, the participants spent 5 minutes talking to each other. At the end of all sessions, if 2 participants like each other, they exchange email addresses. Speed dates are common because they predispose people to make snap judgments. The tennis legend Andre Agassi claimed he rolled his racket over the tennis ball before hitting the forehand. Why he did it, he could not explain convincingly. Human behavior is difficult to ascertain because people are mainly unaware of the things that affect their actions, yet they don't feel unaware. This gives them the feeling that they are not ignorant. People want to think that there are logical explanations for why they fall in love with certain people, but it often comes down to snap judgments. Chapter 4. The election of Warren Harding is an excellent example of the pitfalls of thin slicing. Harry Dougherty and Warren Harding met at a shoe shines workshop. Harding looked presidential, and Dougherty was impressed with his charisma and handsome face. Indeed, he was so impressed that he suggested that Harding would make a great president. But Harding never did meet those potentials. He was not astute. He was promiscuous. He never distinguished himself in the Senate. He ascended in government because of Dougherty, and he looked like a great charismatic leader. He ran for president and became one of the worst presidents in the history of America, according to historians. This election is a good example because people depended on the wrong information in their haste to decide. We often assume things about people because of how they look and act, but how can you be sure they're being authentic? Adaptive unconsciousness can be irrationally partisan. Taller male candidates have a higher probability of getting a job in an interview. The average male American CEO is about 3 inches above the national average for men. It then could be true that most American business people are not deliberately racist, sexist, or have a bias for height. Bob Golam is a great salesman that works for a Nissan car dealership. He excels in car sales because he can assess a buyer's interest in a few seconds. But he does not assess based only on the buyer's appearance, age, race, height, and gender. Most car dealerships suffer from the Warren Harding problem. Many car dealers assume that women and black people are less intelligent than white men, and therefore try harder to sell them an overpriced vehicle. Did you know? In a study published in 2005, Princeton University students were shown photos of candidates from the last 3 U.S. congressional races. On average, the students picked an actual winner of the election almost 70% of the time. Chapter 5. Spontaneous thinking is an act of humorous improvisation governed by a set of rules. Paul Van Riper is a tall, lean man who served in Vietnam. Soldiers remember him as an intense, alluring commander who was willing to risk his life for the good of the mission and his soldiers. Pentagon officials recruited him to invent a program aimed at training American troops and testing new military strategies. He was to play the rogue commander. The program was called the Millennium Challenge. The Millennium Challenge gave some interesting results. The blue team, representing the USA, was given greater intellectual resources like operational net assessment, which analyzed the enemy into their most vulnerable bits. They also had a tool called effects-based operations, which enabled them to think beyond conventional military methods. The red team used improvisational and erratic schemes. The blue team assumed it would be easy to defeat the red team due to the resource advantage. To their surprise, the red team was able to counter every attack thrown at them, and in a single day, despite their numbers, destroyed the blue team. The blue team leaders were inept at imagining Van Riper would supersede their predictions and assaults and crush them. Spontaneous thinking is an act of humorous improvisation. It seems difficult and arbitrary, but it is not. A series of rules governs it. Spontaneity is not random. People make snap judgments, but they also follow certain intuitive rules. One side of the human brain thinks in words, the left hemisphere, while the other thinks in pictures, the right hemisphere. Anytime you have to describe something in words, it tends to displace your visual memory. Psychologist Jonathan W. Schuler described this as verbal overshadowing. Overload of information makes decision-making harder. There is a need to cut back on unnecessary information to be an excellent decision-maker. Chapter 6. There is a right and wrong way to ask people what they want. When a group is told to critique an idea, a song, or a concept, their assessment may be a far cry from what experts in the field think. It could also misrepresent the taste of the larger population. Dr. John Gottman discovered how much we could learn about what people think by simply analyzing their body language and facial expressions, or by stealing a look at their bookshelves and the decor of their personal space, then by asking them directly. People spontaneously volunteer information about the motive of their actions. Interestingly, many of their submissions are often incorrect, as decisions are made subconsciously. Consumer polls are sometimes unreliable as they seem to be plucked out of thin air. So, on occasions when marketers request consumer feedback on a certain product or service, to explain whether they like a song that just played or a movie they just saw or a politician they just heard, how accurate will decisions based on their opinion be? For example, any musician would think it reasonable to seek popular opinion. However, the reality proves popular opinion is often faulty, and folks running the polls are hardly concerned about the implication and misinformation caused by the process. One of the notable challenges, a concept called sensation transference, was coined by Louise Cheskin, one of the prolific influencers of 20th century marketing. Cheskin was born in Ukraine in the early 21st century and relocated to the United States as a child. Cheskin believed that people usually transfer their sensations or impressions about a product's packaging to the product itself. Hence, the customer subconsciously assesses something they are likely to buy in a supermarket or a department store. To simplify, Cheskin believed that many consumers could not differentiate between a package and its product. For them, the product and package are one and the same. Chapter 7. Humans perform at their peak when their heart rate is between 115 and 145 beats per minute. The human body's response to stress manifests in one of several ways. Some examples are diminished sound, tunnel vision, extreme visual clarity, and the sense that time is slowly coming to a standstill. These inferences were gathered from various people who had undergone stress under varying conditions. Remember, under pressure and at a breaking point, our bodies proceed to shut down many sources of information, so much that we lose the use of our senses. Former Army Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman argues in his book On Killing that the optimal state of arousal, the range in which stress remains productive, is when the heart rate lingers between 115 and 145 beats per minute. Grossman put his money on the line with this postulation by measuring the heart rate of champion marksman Ron Avery. The study revealed Avery's pulse was at the peak of the mentioned heart rate range whenever he performed in the field. However, Grossman noticed that things start to go south when the heart rate exceeds 145. Psychomotor skills start going amok, and the symmetrical balance becomes almost impossible. At 175, the brain begins to lose its coordinative grasp of the body, and we begin to see an absolute breakdown of cognitive processing. The forebrain shuts down, and the midbrain, the part of the brain that is the same as your dog's, all mammals have that part of the brain, reaches up and hijacks the forebrain. Vision gets uncontrollably skewed. Behavior becomes unpredictable and erratic. More often than not, people at the receiving end of gunfire or shelling may empty their bowels or bladder, usually because the strange level of the threat represented by the heightened heart rate of 175 and above makes the body see controlling the muscles of the anus as non-essential. There is a recall of blood from the outer muscle layers and concentrated in core muscle mass at such times. The reason for that is to presumably make the muscles as hard as possible, thus turning them into a pseudo-armor, which helps in limiting bleeding, should there be an injury. Every moment, every blink is composed of a series of discrete moving parts, and every one of those parts offers an opportunity for intervention, reform, and correction. Chapter 8. Blink teaches us to listen with our ears and heart, rather than our eyes. Abby Conant, a professional musician who played the trombone in Italy for the Royal Opera of Turin, auditioned for the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra. They had mistaken her for a man in their response to her application. This period was a time when women were considered unable to handle the rigors of classical music. Hence, they were already judged as incompetent before they struck a note. By luck, Conant beat the odds. The auditions had to be played behind a screen because the orchestra's cultural center was under construction at the time. Screened auditions were rare in Europe at the time. Conant was the 16th performer, and she played Ferdinand David's Concertino for trombone, the Warhorse audition piece in Germany. Despite missing a note, the Philharmonic's music director, Sergio Celibidache, picked her, and the remaining 17 applicants were sent home. The concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic, Rainer Kuchel, once boasted of being able to differentiate between a female and male violinist with his eyes closed. He thought that with astute training, the ear could pick up the nuances of the female style, but this was all a lie. Subsequently, rules were put in place forbidding the judges from speaking among themselves during auditions, so that one person's opinion wouldn't cloud others' views. Musicians were identified by number rather than by name. Screens were set up to visually separate the committee and the auditioner. If the auditioner made any sound or wore any footwear that could give away their identity or gender, they were ushered out or given a new number. Since the advent of screened auditions, the population of women in reputable U.S. orchestras jumped fivefold. The very first time the new rules for auditions were used, we were looking for 4 new violinists, remembers Herb Wexlublat, a tuba player for the Metropolitan Opera in New York and figurehead in the introduction of screened auditions in the mid-1960s. Interestingly, all the Metropolitan Opera's tuba audition winners were women. That would simply never have happened before, since the tuba had always been known as a masculine instrument. When you listen to music with your eyes, your judgment will be affected. However, when you choose to listen with your heart and your ears, you'll be more objective in your assessment. Conclusion. Often we make do with information supplied only in the blink of an eye. It appears as though we do not have much control over what bubbles to the surface from our unconscious, but we do. Taking a moment to think carefully allows you to avoid making fast decisions that aren't based on facts. Whenever Thomas Hoving wanted to see a work of art, he would take special steps to ensure his early impressions were as good as possible. He controlled, protected, and educated his unconscious mind. While first impressions are important, we should challenge them to make sure that we're not simply making snap judgments based upon what we're seeing within a very short amount of time. If we can control the environment in which rapid cognition takes place, then we can control rapid cognition. We can prevent the people fighting wars or staffing emergency rooms or policing the streets from making mistakes. Malcolm Gladwell. It's easy to assume things and follow the crowd, but you need to think for yourself and make your own decisions. If you constantly rely on snap judgments to base long-term decisions, you miss out on a large portion of information. How can you be sure you're seeing the full picture? The lessons of Blink teach us to maximize the potential of the unconscious mind, gain control over the ability to make snap judgments in a fair, objective manner, and employ a more measured, careful way of thinking. Try this. When you realize that you might be underperforming, take steps to calm yourself and reduce stress. Avoid making assumptions without knowing the full picture. Ask questions if necessary. When you feel like you're about to start jumping to conclusions, stop, take a breath, and seek further information.